The newsroom buzzed with energy as the morning crew prepared for what was meant to be a simple feature on the Ridgewood Police Department. Cameramen adjusted their lenses, producers barked last-minute instructions, and reporter Melissa Carter rehearsed her opening lines, her voice steady despite the usual pre-broadcast nerves. Melissa, a seasoned journalist known for her composed demeanor, glanced at her reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. Her dark brown eyes gleamed with determination, and her sleek black blazer was impeccable. As always, this wasn't her first live segment, but the stakes were always high when the cameras rolled. "Melissa, you ready?" Her producer, Ryan, called out from across the room. He was a wiry man in his 40s, perpetually stressed but brilliant at his job. "Always," she replied with a small smile. Today's segment was straightforward, a live, behind-the-scenes look at the Ridgewood Police Department to showcase the officers' hard work and dedication. It was a PR move as much as it was journalism, an effort to rebuild public trust after a string of controversies had left the department's reputation in tatters. Melissa wasn't blind to the irony. She had covered stories of police misconduct before, gritty exposés that revealed the cracks in the system, but today wasn't about that. This was meant to be light, positive, even inspiring, a chance for the department to control the narrative for once. "All right, people, let's roll." Ryan clapped his hands. Melissa stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway of the precinct, where Officer Daniel Wright waited. He was the chosen face of the department for the segment, a veteran with 15 years on the force, a square jaw, and a demeanor that screamed model officer. "Officer Wright, thanks for having us," Melissa said warmly as she extended a hand. "Of course," he replied, his handshake firm, "happy to show people what we do here." The cameraman counted down. "Live in 3, 2, 1. Melissa's professional smile returned, and her voice took on its broadcast tone. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Carter, coming to you live from the Ridgewood Police Department. Today, we'll take you inside the lives of the men and women who work tirelessly to keep our community safe." The camera panned to Officer Wright, who nodded solemnly. "Officer Wright, you've been with the department for over a decade. What keeps you motivated to serve?" "It's the people," Wright said smoothly, as if he'd rehearsed the line 100 times. "Protecting the innocent, making sure justice is upheld, that's what this job is about." Melissa nodded, her gaze unwavering. She knew how to make her subjects feel comfortable, how to guide an interview without drawing attention to herself. The segment unfolded as planned, with Wright leading them through the precinct, explaining the ins and outs of police work. But as they moved through the building, something about Wright's demeanor struck Melissa as off. His words were polished, almost too perfect, as if he were reciting a script. There was a tightness in his smile, a flicker of something unspoken behind his eyes. The crew set up in the break room for the next segment. Melissa took a moment to review her notes while the cameraman adjusted his equipment. Wright stood a few feet away, chatting with a younger officer. That's when it happened. A technician in the control room accidentally left Wright's lapel microphone live during a break. Unbeknownst to anyone in the room, his voice was still being broadcast to viewers at home. "Can you believe this?" Wright muttered to his colleague, his voice dripping with disdain, "parading us around like we're in some kind of circus. And that reporter? Typical, always sticking their noses where they don't belong." The younger officer chuckled nervously, clearly unsure how to respond. "Yeah, well, it's just PR, right?" "PR," Wright scoffed. "We're babysitting these people. Waste of time. You see the guy we brought in yesterday? Another one of those punks. They all look the same, trouble written all over their faces." The words hung in the air, venomous and unmistakable. Back in the newsroom, chaos erupted. The control room staff froze as they realized what was happening. "His MIC is still hot," one of the technicians shouted, his face pale. The producer's voice crackled over Melissa's earpiece. "Melissa, we've got a problem. Wright's MIC is live." Her heart stopped. "What do you mean, live?" "Everything he's saying is going out, right now." Melissa's mind raced. This wasn't just a technical error, it was a disaster. She glanced at Wright, who was still oblivious, laughing with his colleague as his words poured into homes across the city. Social media exploded within minutes. Viewers flooded Twitter and Facebook with clips of the broadcast, their outrage palpable. Hashtags like #racistcop and #MIClive started trending almost immediately. At the station, phones rang off the hook as angry viewers demanded answers. Melissa forced herself to stay calm. "Cut the feed," she said into her earpiece. "We're trying," Ryan replied, his voice frantic. The system's lagging, we can't shut it down fast enough. By the time the broadcast was finally pulled, the damage was done. Clips of Wright's comments were already circulating online, dissected and shared by thousands. Wright turned to Melissa, oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. "So, where to next?" he asked, flashing that practiced smile. Melissa stared at him, her expression unreadable. "I think we're done here," she said quietly. It wasn't until she left the precinct and checked her phone that she saw the full extent of what had happened. Notifications flooded her screen, texts from colleagues, emails from her editor, and countless mentions on social media. "Racist cop exposed live on air," one tweet read, accompanied by a clip of Wright's comments. Another, "This is why we don't trust the system. This is who's protecting us." Melissa exhaled, her chest tight. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a reckoning. For Officer Wright, for the department, and perhaps even for herself. The atmosphere in the Ridgewood Police Department was eerily quiet as Officer Daniel Wright stepped into the briefing room the following morning. The usual banter among the officers was replaced with awkward glances and hushed whispers. Wright, oblivious to the growing storm, adjusted his badge and scanned the room, his confidence undeterred. "Morning, folks," he greeted, his voice cutting through the silence. A few officers mumbled replies, their eyes avoiding his. Wright frowned but dismissed it, chalking up the tension to a routine day in law enforcement. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, it was anything but routine. Protesters gathered in droves, holding signs that read "End racism in policing" and "Justice for all." The chants of the crowd grew louder by the minute, their voices echoing through the parking lot. Melissa Carter sat in her car across the street, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous day on an endless loop. The viral clip of Wright's comments had turned her report into a national scandal overnight. Her phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was Ryan, her producer. "You heading in?" he asked without preamble. "I'm parked outside," she replied. "What's the situation?" "Chaos," he said bluntly. "The department's in full damage control mode. They're holding a press conference this afternoon, but trust me, it's not going to help." Melissa sighed. "And Wright?" "Still doesn't get it," Ryan said. "He showed up to work like nothing happened. Can you believe that?" Before Melissa could respond, a sharp knock on her car window startled her. She turned to see a young woman standing there, her face tense with frustration. "Are you the reporter?" the woman demanded as Melissa rolled down the window. "Yes, I'm Melissa Carter. Can I help you?" "You can help by asking the right questions," the woman shot back. "That cop, Wright, he's been like this for years. Everyone knows it, but no one's done anything. You've got a platform. Use it." Melissa stared at her, momentarily caught off guard. "What do you mean? Everyone knows?" The woman crossed her arms, her anger barely contained. "Ask around. People in this neighborhood have been complaining about him forever. Harassment, profiling, you name it. He hides behind that badge, and the department covers for him. Yesterday wasn't a slip, it was who he is." Melissa's journalistic instincts kicked in. "Would you be willing to go on record?" The woman hesitated, glancing at the protesters behind her. "Maybe," she said finally, "but only if you promise to tell the whole truth, not just what makes headlines." "I promise," Melissa said firmly, pulling out her notepad. Back inside the precinct, Wright was beginning to notice the shift in the atmosphere. The usual camaraderie among the officers had been replaced with stiff politeness, and the command staff had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing. "What's going on with everyone?" Wright muttered to his partner, Officer Martinez, as they walked out of the room. Martinez avoided his gaze. "You really don't know?" "Know what?" Wright snapped, his patience wearing thin. Martinez sighed. "The broadcast yesterday. Your MIC was live. Man, people heard what you said." Wright froze, his mind racing. "What do you mean, they heard?" Martinez pulled out his phone and opened a news app. "This is what I mean," he said, handing the screen to Wright. The headline read, "Racist cop exposed live on air, officer's comments spark outrage." Below it was a video of Wright's remarks, complete with subtitles for emphasis. Wright's face turned red as he scrolled through the article. "This is taken out of context," he muttered. "It's not what it looks like." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't sound like it to me. People are pissed. Man, the department's scrambling to deal with this." Before Wright could respond, the chief's voice boomed from the hallway. "Wright, my office, now." The chief's office was small and cluttered, but his presence filled the space. Chief Reynolds was a stern, no-nonsense man with decades of experience, and his expression left no room for misunderstanding. "Sit," he ordered as Wright entered. Wright sat, his jaw clenched. "Chief, I can explain." Reynolds held up a hand to silence him. "I don't want explanations. I want accountability. Do you have any idea what you've done? This department is under fire because of you." "With all due respect, sir, it was a mistake," Wright began. "People are blowing this out of proportion." "A mistake?" Reynolds cut him off, his voice rising. "You called a suspect a thug and said they all look the same. That's not a mistake, Wright. That's blatant racism." Wright's mouth opened, but no words came out. Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes cold. "You've put us in an impossible position. The mayor's office is demanding action. The press is camped outside, and the community," he shook his head. "You've lost their trust, if you ever had it to begin with." "What are you saying?" Wright asked, his voice low. "I'm saying you're suspended, effective immediately," Reynolds replied, "pending an internal investigation." Wright stood, his face flushed with anger. "You're just going to throw me under the bus?" "You threw yourself under the bus," Reynolds shot back. "Now get out of my office." As Wright stormed out, Melissa was preparing for her next move. The woman she had spoken to earlier had given her a list of names, people in the community who had stories to tell about Officer Wright. By the end of the day, Melissa had spoken to half a dozen residents, each with their own account of harassment and discrimination. A pattern emerged. Wright's actions weren't an anomaly, they were part of a larger problem. Her phone buzzed again. It was Ryan. "Melissa, you're not going to believe this," he said. "The department's press conference just ended, and it's already a disaster. They tried to downplay it, but the protesters aren't buying it. This thing is getting bigger by the hour." Melissa glanced at the notes in her lap, her determination solidifying. "Good," she said, "because I'm just getting started." The Ridgewood Community Center was packed, the hum of tense conversation filling the air. People of all ages, backgrounds, and professions gathered, drawn by the scandal surrounding Officer Wright. Word had spread quickly that Melissa Carter, the reporter whose live broadcast had exposed him, was looking for stories. Melissa stood at the front of the room, her notepad and recorder ready. She scanned the crowd, her sharp journalist's instincts kicking in as she identified potential voices for her report. This wasn't going to be just another story about a bad cop, it was a chance to amplify the voices of those who had been ignored for too long. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "I know this is a difficult subject, but your experiences matter. What happened yesterday shined a light on something bigger than just one man. If you're willing to share your stories, I promise to tell them honestly." The room was silent for a moment before an older man stepped forward. His hair was graying at the temples, and he walked with the aid of a cane. "My name is Clarence," he said, his voice rough but clear. "I've lived in Ridgewood for 45 years, and I've seen a lot, but nothing quite like Officer Wright." Clarence paused, his hands tightening on the cane. "Last year, my grandson was walking home from basketball practice. Wright stopped him, said he'd fit the description of someone who'd been stealing from cars. My grandson tried to explain, but Wright didn't listen. He had him on the ground, handcuffed, before anyone could say a word. He was 14 years old. 14. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "Did you file a complaint?" Melissa asked gently. Clarence shook his head. "What good would it have done? Complaints disappear in this town. They always have." A young woman raised her hand next. Her voice trembled as she introduced herself. "My name's Angela. I was pulled over by Wright a few months ago. He said my taillight was out, but it wasn't. He searched my car without permission, kept asking if I had drugs. When I told him he had no right, he smirked and said, 'Who's going to believe you over me?'" Tears welled up in her eyes, and a woman beside her placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Melissa's notepad filled quickly as person after person shared their encounters with Wright. Each story painted a damning portrait of a man who had abused his authority with impunity, protected by a system unwilling to hold him accountable. Across town, Officer Wright sat in his darkened living room, the curtains drawn tightly. His suspension had turned his life upside down in less than 24 hours. The television droned on in the background, every channel covering the protests, the press conference, and the growing calls for his resignation. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from his wife. "Turn on Channel 8, now." Reluctantly, he grabbed the remote and switched the channel. There she was, Melissa Carter, standing in front of the community center. her microphone in hand. Behind me, residents of Ridgewood are gathering to share their experiences with Officer Daniel Wright, she said. What began as a viral moment has now become a movement, with the community demanding answers and accountability. The camera cut to Clarence, his voice quivering with anger as he repeated his story. Then Angela, tears streaking her face as she described the humiliation she endured. Wright's jaw tightened. This wasn't fair. They were twisting the narrative, making him look like a monster. He grabbed his phone and opened Facebook, scrolling through post after post condemning him. Racist cops like Wright are the problem, one comment read. Fire him and clean house at Ridgewood PD, another demanded. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was his union representative. Dan, the voice on the other end said, we need to talk. About what? Wright snapped, though he already knew the answer. About damage control. The department's looking for a scapegoat, and it's going to be you. They're talking about termination. Termination? Wright's voice rose. They can't do that. I've been on the force for 15 years. It doesn't matter, the rep said bluntly. You've become a liability. The public's demanding blood, and the brass is ready to give it to them. Unless you've got a way to fix this, you're done. Wright ended the call, his hands shaking. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had dedicated his life to this job, to keeping the community safe. But now, the same community was turning on him. Meanwhile, back at the community center, Melissa approached a woman who had been sitting quietly in the corner. She looked younger than most of the others, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Hi, Melissa said softly. Would you like to share your story? The woman hesitated, then nodded. My name's Tasha, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I'm scared of him. I don't mean the police in general, I mean Wright, specifically. Melissa's brow furrowed. Why is that? Tasha glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer. Because he's followed me home before. Not on duty, off duty. He'd park his car down the street and just sit there, watching. I told my mom, but she said I shouldn't do anything. She said I'd only make it worse. Melissa's stomach churned. Do you think he was trying to intimidate you? Tasha nodded. It felt like a warning, like he wanted me to know he was always watching. Melissa's recorder captured every word, and her determination deepened. This wasn't just about accountability anymore, it was about exposing a culture of fear and unchecked power. As the meeting wound down, Melissa thanked everyone for their courage. Your stories matter, she said, and I promise to do everything I can to make sure they are heard. Outside, the protests had swelled to nearly triple their original size. The chants were deafening now. No justice, no peace, no racist police. Melissa stepped into the throng, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't know how this story would end, but one thing was clear, the people of Ridgewood weren't going to stay silent anymore. And neither was she. The next morning, Melissa's report aired on the evening news. The broadcast was raw, unflinching, and packed with first-hand accounts from Ridgewood residents. It wasn't just about Officer Wright, it was about a system that had enabled him for years. The headline was simple but cutting, Voices of Ridgewood, exposing the rot in local policing. The segment opened with Clarence's trembling voice recounting his grandson's unjust arrest, followed by Angela's chilling testimony about being profiled and humiliated. Tasha's story came last, her quiet fear lingering in the air as viewers listened to her describe being watched and intimidated in her own home. Across Ridgewood, the broadcast had an immediate and visceral impact. Families gathered around their televisions, watching in stunned silence. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForRidgewood and #EndPoliceAbuse began trending within minutes. In his dimly lit living room, Officer Wright sat motionless, his face pale as the stories unfolded on screen. For the first time, he couldn't dismiss what was happening as overreaction or bad optics. These were real people, and their pain was undeniable. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed. You need to say something, she said, her tone sharp. To who? Wright snapped, his frustration boiling over. Everyone's already made up their minds. To the people you hurt, she shot back. You think you're the victim here, but you're not. They are. Wright glared at her but said nothing. Meanwhile, at the Ridgewood Police Department, chaos reigned. Chief Reynolds was locked in his office with his command staff, their voices rising as they debated how to handle the fallout. The mayor's office is demanding we take immediate action, Reynolds barked, slamming his fist on the table. This isn't just about Wright anymore, this is about the entire department. One of his deputies shifted uncomfortably in his seat. If we fire him, it'll look like we're caving to public pressure. And if we don't, Reynolds retorted, we'll lose what little trust we have left with the community. Either way, we're screwed. Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What about the complaints? He asked. How many are we dealing with? A junior officer flipped through a stack of papers. Officially, 12 complaints against Wright in the last 5 years. Unofficially, who knows how many more went unreported. Reynolds shook his head. Unbelievable. And none of these ever made it past internal affairs? The room fell silent. Exactly what I thought, Reynolds muttered. We failed, plain and simple, and now we're paying the price. Outside the station, the protests had grown exponentially. Local activists had joined forces with larger organizations, drawing attention from national media. The chants were no longer just about Wright, they were about systemic reform. Melissa stood among the crowd, her camera crew capturing the scene. She had spent the morning interviewing organizers and protesters, their passion and determination shining through in every word. One protester, a young man named Jordan, spoke with fire in his voice. This isn't just about one bad cop, he said. This is about every person who's ever been silenced, every complaint that's been ignored. We're done asking nicely. It's time for change. Another protester, an older woman named Evelyn, carried a sign that read, My son deserves to walk free. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears as she explained her presence. My boy was arrested by Wright 3 years ago, she said. He didn't do anything wrong, but they locked him up anyway. I'm here because no mother should have to go through what I did. Melissa listened intently, her notepad filling with quotes and observations. This was more than a story now, it was a movement. Inside the station, Wright paced his temporary desk, his mind racing. The suspension felt like a noose tightening around his career. He could hear the distant roar of the crowd outside, their chants ringing in his ears like a relentless drumbeat. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number. It was Martinez, his former partner. What do you want? Martinez's tone was cold. I need your help, Wright said, his voice unsteady. You know I'm not a bad cop. You've worked with me for years. Tell them. Tell them what? Martinez snapped. That you've been harassing people for as long as I've known you? That I've watched you cross the line more times than I can count. Face it, Wright, you did this to yourself. Wright's grip tightened on the phone. You're supposed to have my back. Not this time, Martinez said firmly. Not anymore. The line went dead, leaving Wright alone with his thoughts. As night fell, the protests showed no signs of slowing down. The police department issued a statement announcing Wright's termination, but it did little to calm the crowd. For many, it was too little, too late. Melissa sat in her car, reviewing the footage from the day. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. Incredible work today. The network's thrilled. Keep it up. She leaned back in her seat, exhaustion creeping in. This story had taken everything out of her, but she wasn't done yet. The voices of Ridgewood still had more to say, and she was determined to amplify them. In his darkened living room, Wright stared at the termination notice on his email. His career was over, his reputation in shambles. For the first time, he felt the weight of accountability, and it was crushing. But outside, the voices of Ridgewood rose higher, their collective cry for justice echoing into the night. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The sun rose over Ridgewood, but the town felt different. The air buzzed with anticipation as the protests continued, their momentum undeterred. News vans lined the streets, reporters documenting every moment as the nation watched Ridgewood become a symbol of resistance. Melissa sat in the corner of a coffee shop, surrounded by her equipment. Her laptop screen glowed with the beginnings of her final report, Ridgewood's Reckoning, A Town Demands Justice. She was exhausted, but there was no stopping now. The culmination of weeks of work was within reach. Across town, the Ridgewood Police Department prepared for the press conference. Chief Reynolds adjusted his tie in the mirror, his face grim. This wasn't just about Officer Wright anymore, it was about the department's failure to act. The community demanded accountability, and he was the face of their anger. By noon, the crowd outside the station had swelled to thousands. Signs and banners waved in the air, their messages clear: justice for all, no more silence, end racist policing. Melissa took her place among the media, her cameraman setting up for the live broadcast. Her heart pounded as Chief Reynolds stepped to the podium, flanked by other senior officers. Good afternoon, Reynolds began, his voice steady but heavy. I want to start by saying that we hear you. The people of Ridgewood have made their voices clear, and we cannot ignore them any longer. He paused, glancing at the sea of faces before him. Effective immediately, Officer Daniel Wright has been terminated from the Ridgewood Police Department. Additionally, we are launching an independent review of all past complaints against our officers to ensure that justice is served. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others demanding more. This is not enough, a protester shouted. We need systemic change. Reynolds raised his hand for silence. I know this is just the beginning. We have a long way to go to rebuild trust, but I promise you this, we will do better. The crowd remained skeptical, their trust broken by years of inaction. Melissa's camera captured every moment, the tension palpable. As the press conference concluded, Melissa's phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. Thank you for listening to us, for giving us a voice. Melissa smiled faintly, her exhaustion momentarily lifted. This was why she did this work, for the people who needed someone to believe in them. Later that evening, Melissa's final report aired. It was raw and unflinching, highlighting not just Wright's actions but the systemic failures that had allowed them. The footage of the protests, the voices of Ridgewood residents, and the admissions from the department painted a powerful picture. But it wasn't the end. A week later, a special town hall meeting was held, this time organized by the community. Melissa attended, her notepad in hand. Clarence took the stage first, his voice strong despite his years. This isn't just about one officer, he said. It's about making sure no one else in this town has to live in fear. It's about creating a system that serves all of us. One by one, residents shared their ideas for reform, citizen oversight committees, body cameras, better training for officers. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a community finally taking control of its future. For Wright, however, there was no redemption. In the days following his termination, new allegations surfaced. Former colleagues began speaking out, admitting they had witnessed his behavior but felt powerless to intervene. Facing potential criminal charges, Wright retreated from public view. His name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when accountability is ignored. Months later, Ridgewood began to heal. The police department implemented sweeping reforms, and trust slowly started to rebuild. Melissa moved on to her next story, but the people of Ridgewood never forgot her role in their fight for justice. As she packed up her equipment one last time, Melissa glanced at her notes. The final words she wrote before closing her notebook were simple but powerful. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of change.